And we've got this notion that you've taught me about, which is around thinking about skills as opposed to being so fixated on a container, if you will, called a job. So what breaks down that you're finding today, Sophie, when we're just overly fixated on sort of jobs as opposed to skills?
Employees are already finding that a huge percentage, I think it was like 70% of employees have work that is outside of their job description. Why? Because that's just how work is evolving. And whether it's to do with AI or just because we're just serving people in different ways, we're using different technologies, we're collaborating across different disciplines, and we're using our skills in different ways. So if you remember when digital first came in and it cut across all the organization, it was very difficult because it had elements in every single division, but the divisions never talked to each other. So it really didn't fit very well. This is where we need to be thinking about it. If had everybody focused on the customer journey, then all those invisible elements start connecting, because I can talk to product development and I can be talking to sales, and we can start understanding how all these different things fit together when we're trying to provide services to the customer. I think there are lots of ways that we can be using technology and using AI to reduce some of that load and have managers focused on leading rather than leading, creating that vision, connecting, just sort of overseeing and helping understand each individual person. How shall I best help Matt be most successful?
My very special guest is a workforce innovator, keynote speaker, instructor, author, and founder of FlexCell Network. Over 650,000 people have taken her LinkedIn courses on future of work skills, Gen Z, and empathy. She's the author of Empathy Works, The Key to Competitive Advantage in the New Era of Work, and host of the Transforming Work with Sophie Wade podcast. She is quite obviously Sophie Wade. Welcome to the show, Sophie.
Oh, yeah. It's great to be here, Matt. Thanks for having me.
I always love it when my intro spoils the big reveal, but I suppose there's not much of a reveal anyway, because it's like your name's right there in the title of the podcast episode. Like, who do I think I'm fooling? Oh, well, I love doing it that way. It's just, what can we do, right? But I wanted to get us started with this one. I didn't mention it in your intro, but I believe you told me you've worked in as many as 5 different countries or something like that. You've seen so many different work cultures in the organizations you've been a part of and consulted with. And I thought to get us started, so if you can just let me know, what's kind of these beliefs about work we hold that probably aren't all that constructive and productive? What are some of those damaging beliefs that kind of persist across different countries, different organization styles and sizes?
I love this question because it does go to the fact that I started off actually my work career in Hong Kong, and I was working 2 Saturdays out of every 3, only in like 9 till 1, for 5 years. I've worked in Germany, very much a 9 to 5 environment, even though I was working, with technology people. And so those were the only people who really worked beyond that, and even at weekends, which was very, very different. The work culture here in the US is more exaggerated, I would say, than the whole of Western Europe. And so having this very broad range of experiences really helped me understand that there isn't one way of working. It isn't just how people do it in the US or just how people do it in the UK or whichever. And so that really opened up my eyes to, it's very, very different. So in terms of the aspects of work, the way that we can be thinking about work that I don't think are helpful, one is, which the research is very, very clear, the longer you work, it's not going to keep producing more outcomes, better outcomes, more results, right? There's a peak, and it's not, I think it's like 55 hours or something, or even fewer, that at that point you have diminishing returns, absolutely have diminishing returns. And in fact, from, if I remember correctly, back in the 1920s, paid vacations in the US were introduced by corporations, not by the government, because they saw that workers were being burned out. So I think this like longer hours is going to be better for the business. The second thing, very tightly coupled with that, is that if you don't work long hours, you're not a good person, or you're not, you're lazy, or you're not contributing sufficiently. But it does go kind of tied a bit to that you're not a good person. You're not really doing your sort of duty. And there has been a lot of aspect of the fact that work is duty. And that isn't how people really think about it now. And it was tied to Calvinist documents and the fact that you could have sort of needed to suffer and work in order to go to heaven. So I think once we recognize some of the very historical ties that we have to work, that we can think a bit about it differently. Yes, people want to contribute. Yes, people want to sort of see what matters, like contribute to things that are bigger than themselves. But we can actually try and disconnect from some of these historical ties, which aren't necessarily helpful.
I think you're such a systems thinker. You've studied the history of these things, and it's amazing how long these can persist. You're talking about Calvinist principles. They form the bedrock of our economy, our society, certainly generationally, our parents and our own attitudes about work. It's all this really long-standing tradition, and I think we rarely stop and think about that relative to our day-to-day.
Here's a crazy one then. So I thought when I started all of this work that the reason we worked an 40-hour week, I go 80, was because the machines turned on and off 9 o'clock and 5 o'clock. Of course they weren't. They were going 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So that was like a first mistake. But I found out that it's actually the 40-hour work week, which was something that was suggested by a guy called Robert Owen in 1917, who is a Welsh utopian. So it was sort of more of a sort of socialist thing. And it was 8 hours of leisure, 8 hours of labor, and 8 hours of rest. And that amazing marketing slogan ran around the world, and lots of countries adopted it. It wasn't actually until 1938 that it was adopted in the US. But that was just kind of like a nice marketing slogan for how we should work. And it's random. It's completely arbitrary. That was the point. I was like, okay, so we can actually decide exactly how many hours we should or could or whatever work. And isn't it, shouldn't we be focused on results rather than hours? Just saying.
And that's why I think now when something comes along like AI and productivity has come into focus, both because of what's possible, I would say, with new technology revolution, but also in the light of economic headwinds and the scary things that are pulling our organizations and even our markets apart a little bit, then all of a sudden here comes that duty. Now all of a sudden we're questioning work ethic. If you're not using AI around the clock and still willing to work the same amount of hours, or even more hours than before, it's like, wow, we're not machines. Right?
Yes. And we don't work well like that. We don't work well doing the boring stuff. So actually having something come in and take over the automation, because we make mistakes. We get bored, we make mistakes, we get distracted. So let's, focus on the stuff that we're actually good at. There's a lot of things that we could better do by sort of stepping back and saying, how do human beings, now that we've actually got things to help us, allow us to do our best work, what should we best be focused on, and each one of us individually?
Well, let's shift from think about how much we work, or at least the format of that work. Let's talk about work arrangements. I think that you had this interesting take when it comes to an observation around this notion of an independent worker. So I think historically we've seen a lot of examples of the kind of the traditional W-2 employee in the US, your full-time person versus a 1099 independent contractor, which used to be a little bit rare. Now we're seeing that thanks to the gig economy, a lot of reasons, there's a lot more interest in people going freelance, these types of things. What's this nature of an independent worker and kind of that sit somewhere between those two perhaps? And how are we either serving or failing to serve this really important segment of our economy?
So thank you for raising that. So this was actually something that was proposed in December 2015, and it was launched on the Brookings Institute. It's still there. It's an 8-page paper, really easy to read. It was proposed by 2 academics. I can't remember which universities they were from. As well as being supported by Lyft, was one of the people behind it. But there were venture capitalists, there were private equity, there were institutions. It was like very, very well thought through, and about something that was in the middle. So 1099s here and W-2, so full-time and freelance, as you say. So the idea was what doesn't work in having only 2 options is that there's no collective bargaining for freelancers. So that they're very much individuals with I don't like power, but there's no balance. And then employers can't give benefit. So they can only have a very distant relationship with the people who are contracting with them or freelancing with them. So now we have lots of people. What makes sense for companies is they want to have like a pool of familiar freelancers that they can work with regularly. That makes sense for the freelancer, contractor, and the employer. But that becomes more complicated without having this sort of middle ground, and to give so that's sort of the benefits, the repetitiveness, the familiarity. And for the freelancer to have an ability, collective bargaining is always a sort of, a terrible phrase in the US, but to have that, they have a little bit more they have a little bit more power to be represented not just by themselves as one person. So that was the idea. It needed some contributions to employment insurance, but it was a great moment to be thinking about things differently. And I think whether this is the right moment now, but there are lots of younger people, millennials and Gen Zs, Gen Zs, who are yes, taking the freelancer path more than anything. In many cases, one, it's a way for them to actually more easily have, the side hustle. But if they can have more than one employer or one client, then they're actually much more resistant to being laid off. They aren't beholden to one income source. And that's very, very risky, particularly when it seems pretty precarious and the economic situation is very uncertain. That, having only one employer is scary. So I think, that's one of the reasons it came out of the out of the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, a lot of millennials were forced into freelance situations, and then some say, well, I kind of like the lifestyle, and I like to be able to do this, and I can have a range of different things that I'm doing. And when things are changing so much, and you're not quite sure which skills are really going to be the ones to focus on, this can be a really good option. And I do see that this is going to be a trend that continues as we get more and more into the sort of the blended workforce, and companies have smaller sort of core FTEs that they then sort of bring on different freelancers. But there's a lot of things that need to change in order to be more supportive of the non-full-time employees in the workforce.
Yeah, sometimes I've in the course that I teach at Boston College, we study the future of work as well, and we talk about the liquid labor market and the liquid workforce. Because, exactly as you said, you want to do a little bit more of something, but if they're not full-time employees, there's a class of people it just doesn't really exist. And it's amazing to me how much complexity there is, and we're able to absorb it in some ways. But when it comes to the legal assignments or some of these other things, they're just much slower to sort of respond. And I remember one time I talked to one of my Uber drivers, and it was this notion of he was explaining to me that he tried corporate and it didn't work for him. And I thought, you tried corporate? You're talking about all corporate jobs? He said, yeah, I just want the flexibility. I said, so now you drive for Uber? He goes, well, yeah, and Lyft. So even within just ride sharing was like, I'm not going to commit myself just to one. I just kind of bounce back and forth between wherever the fares are better. And I'm like, this is a staggering amount of flexibility.
Yeah,
for that person.
And I always talk to Uber drivers. So I had an Uber driver who was supporting his wife who was doing a degree. I think she was doing a nursing degree, and she had supported him whilst he did something else. And then another guy used to be a truck driver, and he does some extra Uber Eats when they want to go and have kind of like, go on a nice vacation. I mean, there are lots of reasons to be thinking about work in a much more flexible way. And for employers to say, okay, let me just think about the different employment arrangements, because there are lots of there's great talent that they're not going to be able to employ in any way, because those people want to just stay flexible. And particularly, like, for example, top tech talent who just going to say, like, I don't want to just have to work for one employer. They want to have a range of different projects I'm working on and have the flexibility, and also not be risking, everything just being in one with one client, so to speak. So I think that is going to open up for sure. I think that is the direction we're going in. But yes, there's a whole bunch of, whether it's to do with taxation, whether, different states in the US have very different laws about this. It gets very complicated very quickly. But there is some really fun stuff going on to do with, working in different countries for periods of time and being an employer of a record. So I think there's a lot more going on now that sort of more people's eyes have opened up to what flexibility and what location independence and all those kind of things can mean.
It is interesting when you look at how work gets done in organizations. Many years ago, it would be basically everybody's W-2, and that's all we have. Now, there's a lot of agencies, a lot of freelancers, specialists, and now it's kind of like it's hard to draw the boundaries around your organization just strictly on the org chart or just strictly on W2. But it kind of brings me to my next question for you, which is this notion that we've historically thought about, for example, in an org chart, and we still produce org charts, and they just are woeful at explaining how work actually gets done. But they're based around titles and hierarchy and things that aren't as meaningful. But really, they're centered around jobs. And we've got this notion that you've taught me about, which is around thinking about skills as opposed to being so fixated on a container, if you will, called a job. So, what breaks down that you're finding today, Sophie, when we're just overly fixated on sort of jobs as opposed to skills?
Well, employees are already finding that a huge percentage, I think one of the last the points I quoted, I think was like 70% of employees have work that is outside of their job description. Why? Because that's just how work is evolving. And whether it's to do with AI or just because we're just serving things in people in different ways, we're using different technologies, we're, collaborating across different disciplines. And we're using our skills in different ways. So it's like, okay, well, yeah, let's just say, Matt, you're great with AI. So I bring you into a project, which isn't necessarily in a job description, but you're really good at it. So you come in and you sort of help out. And well, but you shouldn't be, so to speak, because that's not under your job description. So that's where it comes from, being driven by technology, driven by the opportunities. And the key about this is that when you are working based on your skills, when you're sort of aligned with your skills and your strengths, you're doing stuff that you're good at, which you typically enjoy. And that really increases revenues, it increases income, and increases profits. There's great Gallup data about that. So that's one aspect of the skills thing. But we really need to be sort of deconstructing these jobs so that when the projects come, so non-routine work, and particularly projects within non-routine work, because of the automation, which has been going on for a couple of decades at least, that's when we can bring together the right people for the right jobs. Now, in fact, consulting companies have been doing this forever. They get a new client, and of course, you have subject matter expertise or industry experts. But, you bring together the right people for that job based on the skills. That's exactly what we're talking about sort of within a company. So people need to understand their skills. And, whenever I'm speaking, I asked, in fact, the last group I asked, it was actually less than 5%. There were only 3 people who actually put their hand up and said they did know that they're top skills. We haven't defined ourselves. We define myself like, what do you do? And you're not something like, what are you good at? And obviously I'm not necessarily going to ask you at a drinks party or something at a coffee shop and say, hey, Matt, what are you good at? But we need to understand what we're good at, what our skills are, and therefore how we can best contribute to a company, to the business, and be able to communicate that as we start trying to get a job. So this is a really big orientation, mindset change, and really trying to understand a lot more about ourselves. And that's going to help people produce results and get jobs more easily, because we've got a really, big disconnect as well in the job market, as we've spoken about before.
I think that the entire situation is rife with challenges and problems. And the first is that, from an industrial organizational psychology perspective, we really think a lot about work and deconstruct it and think about what's really happening. That is not what's happening for the average person who's trying to make a hire. They come up with a job description, job advertisement, job target, whatever you might want to call it. And they're going to Google, copy, paste, make it sound decent and run with it. So even on day one, it's unlikely, in my view, that we have a really accurate explanation of what your role and job even is. By day 2, it's already changed. To your point, 70% of people being like, I'm doing stuff that's not even listed here anymore. We never go back to existing job descriptions and update them for existing employees. It's disastrous.
Well, there's been more progress than I would have assumed. So a couple of years ago, when I was at LinkedIn's Talent Connect, they were really focused on 3 years ago. I think they were talking about really focused on skills. This past October, when I was there are a lot of companies now that do have a skills inventory and a skills taxonomy, but 85% of companies are hiring on skills basis. And because that is so much more successful, they hire better people, people who are matched better to the actual job requirements. And it also does take away you actually have a much bigger talent pool because you're not focused on the skills. You can actually find out where those skills are and be able to sort of hone in on them very quickly when people are able to articulate that and they've sort of been focused on that. So I think that is a major development, which is encouraging and forcing companies to really start to identify what the skills are in their organizations and really sort of bring up that knowledge and that language within a company about skills. Now, that does mean that you have, and that is a key requirement for talent mobility within organizations, which is another piece of that skills and jobs and working on different projects. So in order to be able to have people in flatter organizations be able to move, because there aren't so many layers of hierarchy, to be able to move diagonally or horizontally, that again it's really important to understand skills. So that is a really tough one for very large organizations, but there's much more understanding about that. That's where we have to go. And particularly in this job market where people aren't leaving, they're job hugging, or the great stay. You always love these labels. But when we do have a much more sort of stagnant, you don't have people moving around as much, rather than have people stagnate. And then they're just going to, the younger people will just disengage. Then we do need to be moving them around within the organization. And that requires skills and a lot of other things, but skills, knowledge, and sort of, an internal marketplace.
Yeah, I think that skills, certainly knowledge, cognitive capabilities, behavioral preferences and profiles, there's a lot, as humans, we bring a lot of dimensions to our work, which is pretty powerful. But I think historically, or at least to this point in our conversation, we've been talking about these things almost at the individual level. How do I look at not holding a job, but providing a set of skills required to the organization? But I mentioned it before, you're such an amazing systems thinker. When it comes to the complexity of how these things kind of enmesh, is that even a word? Enmesh, maybe, but how they all kind of come together. My question for you, Sophie, is when you think about these things that are only visible perhaps at the systems level, there's a lot of invisible connections between relationships of entities and the way that they come together and all this stuff. What are some of those most important things that happen when we look at a system as opposed to just looking at it a little too simplistically?
It's very interesting. I mean, there are two big pieces to that question, I think. One is when we're thinking about digital transformation, what I call 2.0 .ai even, digital transformation 70% plus were not successful. And now AI is really forcing the need for that. And that one of the big reasons, which is now understood as to why it didn't work, is that people weren't thinking in a systems way. And the key piece of that, the who wasn't brought along were the people. It was much more focused on sort of projects and initiatives, but it really wasn't communicated well. It wasn't communicated across an organization. So that is where thinking in a sort of company holistic way is really critical for moving people along with digital transformation, which is, it doesn't have to happen across the company at the same time. It can happen in, sort of maybe process-oriented places for the first place, which may be sort of, coding and customer service and maybe sales. But then it really does need to be communicated and explaining to everybody where you're going and how that's going to happen and sort of keep monitoring that overall. The other way that I think about it is in fact, my book, Empathy Works, I talk about the human-centric system and the customer journey and the employee journey. I sort of do a yin-yang thing. And the thing about when we're, one of the things, if you remember when digital first came in and it cut across all the organization, it was very difficult because it had elements in every single division, but the divisions never talked to each other. So it really didn't fit very well. This is where we need to be thinking about if had everybody focus on the customer journey, then all those invisible elements start connecting, because I can talk to product development and I can be talking to sales, and we can start understanding how all these different things fit together when we're trying to provide, services to the customer, because we're all focused. We all know what we're focused on, rather than trying to do it in our little pieces. Because when there's so much complexity, when there's so many different ways that we can be doing it and so many different technologies we're using, it can get very fragmented and, overlapping, contradictory, counterproductive, all of those things. So I think when we can try and look at how the whole thing happens in a more holistic way, and then drop down to like, okay, so what am I doing? And that I think is helpful when you sort of connect it with the purpose, connect it with the vision of where the company is going. That helps at least bring somewhat of a systems systems idea, systems perspective to it, because it's not just about what I'm doing right now in my little purview.
Yeah, I think sometimes, use the term getting in the elevator. So when you go up to the top and you kind of take a big, broad view of the organization and the systems at that point, you can't hang out there exclusively unless you're maybe working really large organizations. But for the most part, you do need to be able to go there. So, this is a leadership conversation that we're having. So I think as a leader, occasionally being able to pick up and see all these connections and understand how some of the more complexities, being able to do that's important in an increasingly complex world. But then exactly to your point, now I got to drill down and go to a specific.
And and you do have people who are working much more across disciplines because you're working at a pace that I need to get on the phone with someone on product development. I may be having to be talking to somebody in marketing, like, how is this going to work? What was the messaging? And that actually is bringing people at a much lower level, connecting across the organization in ways that didn't happen before. And when you have, fewer layers of hierarchy, you don't have the same barriers to those conversations. People are talking more across the organization, and you do have, more accountability and decision making closer to the front line. I think all of those things do help there be more sort of not power distribution, but there's much more activity that it sort of flows in different ways, not just sort of up and down, when as appropriate, as it has done in the past.
And I think historically, like you and I were on a webinar recently, we were talking about the flattening of organizations and we're losing some of the middle. And that's not altogether a bad thing because in some ways the middle doesn't add a ton of value in certain ways. But one of the values that it did provide is that you have a smaller group of people in these middle managers who were a little bit more cross-functional. They're having conversations together, maybe connecting some dots. It's a little bit easier sometimes for individual contributors and even frontline managers to be a little bit more siloed in their thinking, their approach, their incentives, everything. So I think by extension, what we're arguing now is saying, if we think we're going to flatten these organizations, we'd better develop systems level thinking and purview, at least temporarily, or at least every once in a while, when it comes to now lower in the organization, having people have a broader understanding of the business and the customer, for example, as you shared earlier. I think that we're fooling ourselves when we think we're going to eliminate an entire tier of the organization if we don't develop that capability a little further down in the organization and still think we're going to have these really successful outcomes.
Yes, I think, one of the things that when we design work in particular ways, I mean, we have been flattening the organizations. I think AT&T had something like 15 layers. Apparently, somebody told me that they had a graph, like a graph behind them that had all these different things that over the course of your career you might, climb up. They are 5 to 7 layers now. So we have been doing that. I think also when there's more clarity about what people do, the manager should have hopefully less burden, because the whole point of a manager is kind of like, oh, Matt, you need to be doing this and have you done that? But if I'm very clear at the outset, and we have some good project management tools, you know what you're doing. You don't have to keep asking me. But what I can come to you with is kind of like, hey, let's check in. How it's going? Yes, your KPI may have changed because in your customers you're doing that, and we have to pivot a little bit, and we do a sort of course correction. But those are the things that I'm talking to you about, and I'm coaching you more rather than having to have, rather than work being that much more vague and that it has been and much less defined. So I think as we start understanding more about work, being more clear about it, and being more, designing these workflows more clearly and allowing with the ability to flex for whatever might happen, then I think the manager's burden should be decreased.
And that would be that's something I think we would all love to see, which is the administrative burden, the less value add parts of the job. Yes, automate those away. Like if there's not real value being added, we shouldn't hold on to those things. but then to actually use some of our new savings to actually turn up the volume on those actual value-added activities, especially in light of how everything has changed. That's, I think, the better way of looking at how do we move resources from low productivity to high productivity, and what does that look like at each of the different
And there might
layers?
be an agent that I can sort of say, hey, Matt, for these three things, if you have any issues, just go to, Fred, whatever the agent might be,
Go to my digital twin; it'll help you.
right. And
Sure.
that, come to me with the, more nuanced things that that you don't necessarily, you need to a little bit more, explain a bit more of the detail. So I think there are lots of ways that we can be, using technology and using AI to reduce some of that load and have managers focused on leading, rather than leading, creating that vision, connecting, just sort of overseeing and helping understand each individual person. Like, how shall I best, help Matt be most successful? What are his key skills? How does he prefer to be overseen, versus Madge? And be very, very different. And those are the key things that managers really need to be, that's where human beings are, do their best work, is really in some of that human understanding, human connectivity.
Yeah, let's save those bits, the distinctly human bits, for us, and let's put AI to work. And I'll tell you, Sophie, nobody likes putting AI to work more than me. And in fact, we're gonna have a trivia question right now where we're gonna do exactly that. And so I always love to have this. I call it, "Are we smarter than AI?" I don't know why I call
Oh
it that, but
God.
I
I
do.
don't think
I
so.
think we know the answer to that one. But here's what I found. I saw an interview with you at one point where you had an unusual and unexpected productivity hack, which was get a dog. You said that taking dog walks is a good way to kind of reset your mind and to come back and to say, like, yeah, it's a good, it kind of forces you to get up and take it for a walk, come back, clear your head, and you're that much more effective. So I thought I'd give us a question about dog breeds. Now, I think in multiple choice, thankfully, but here's our trivia question. You and I are a team. I don't know the question, I don't know the answers, but here comes. Which dog breed is known for having a blue-black tongue? Is it A, Siberian Husky, B, Chow Chow, or C, German Shepherd? What's your answer? Holy
It's
cow.
definitely not a German Shepherd because I had one, did not have a blue
Okay.
black tongue.
Didn't have blue-black tongue?
Oh, no.
Chow Chow or Siberian Husky? Oh, that's a good one.
I went with Siberian Husky, Siberian. So maybe because that is like the obvious answer, I go with the Chow Chow.
We're going with the Chow Chow. Okay, audience, if you're playing along at home, you can lock in your answer. Which dog breed has a blue-black tongue? Is it A, Siberian Husky, B, Chow Chow, or C, German Shepherd? We are going to go with B, which was the Chow Chow, and let's see how we did here. AI always takes correct. The Chow Chow is indeed known for its distinctive blue-black tongue. This is one of the
But
breed's
I
most
know that
unique
AI
characters.
is sneaky. It's not going to give us the obvious one.
Yeah, you outthought it. So we just proved that Sophie is definitely smarter than AI. I love it. And Sophie, I have a much, much better question for you, which is where can my audience go to learn more about you and all the great work that you're doing?
Okay, so thank you. Yes, I do post a lot of stuff in LinkedIn, lots of links. There's a work in progress report newsletter, which I have there, and on Substack, also modernworklife.co. And life is the four principles, which is learning, intention, flexibility, and empathy, which are the principles of modern work. So modernworklife.co.
Love it. Love it. Thank you so much, Sophie, for being with us today, sharing your insights. Really enjoyed having you on the show.
Been a great conversation. Thank you so much, Matt.
And to my leader listeners, thank you as well for investing in yourself, listening to this great conversation we just had with Sophie. If you've got an extra 30 seconds, please leave a 5-star rating on Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. Helps me attract other listeners who might benefit from these insights. It helps me get great guests like Sophie coming on the show. So that's it for today. As I always say, don't just manage the business when you can lead the people.